categories of speech unprotected by the First Amendment? And the answer to that, I think we find in the two cases that we studied, United States versus Stevens, the depictions of animal cruelty case, and the video games case, in both of which the government argued that the particular speech has so little social value and comes with significant social cost that as a categorical matter the speech is unprotected. And the court in both cases rejected that argument. In Stevens most emphatically, and then Scalia's opinion in the video games case simply accepted the Stevens precedent as controlling in the video games case, the common law method at work. This issue is determined by our decision last year in the Stevens case. And Chief Justice Roberts in the Stevens case rejected the government's proposed test for deciding whether a new category of unprotected speech should be recognized, in addition to obscenity and libel, child pornography and fighting words, whether there should be a new category of depictions of animal cruelty, because that's pretty much valueless speech, and it comes at some cost, at least to the danger to animals that everybody loves. And Roberts really hit that with the back of his hand and said, we don't have any free-floating power. We as court, we as government don't have any power to declare speech is now in an unprotected category, at least if historically it wasn't recognized as a unprotected category, like obscenity and libel and everything else. Then quite a separate question, do prisoners convicted of serious felonies enjoy First Amendment rights? Well, we looked at Danny Martin and his adventures in the court, and in the Danny Martin context at the decision in Procunier versus Martinez, where it's clear that the court clearly did decide that prisoners have some First Amendment rights. That is, not none, but they are seriously circumscribed in the name of prison security, and that if the prison officials can argue that a restriction on prisoner speech, whether it's writing like Danny Martin or reading like dirty magazines coming in, and certainly like speaking out in the mess hall or calling them Gordon names and stuff like that, if the restriction can be justified as relevant to maintaining prison security, then the courts say that's fine. And what we end up with is a category of disfavored speakers, prisoners, who do not have the same First Amendment rights that you and I have, but who share that status with school children, as in the Blomkins case, and with people in the military, and with government employees. Those four classes of second-class citizens for First Amendment purposes were mentioned in the Citizens United case, and then Justice Kennedy gave him the back of his hand. He's making his case that what the First Amendment protects is speech, regardless of the identity of the speaker. And then somebody tugs at his sleeve and says, hey, but wait a minute, we've decided that there are four classes of citizens whose speech can be restricted, even political speech, prisoners, military, school children, and so on. And Kennedy says, well, those institutions couldn't operate without some restrictions on First Amendment rights of the people in them. Not a very persuasive justification, but you have to recognize that there are categories of people, school children, prisoners, and others, who do not enjoy full First Amendment rights. Moving to false speech and libel, what limits does the First Amendment place on the power of states to protect their citizens' reputations? That's Sullivan. Before Sullivan, the answer was none. That the states could protect their citizens' reputations through their own libel law without even looking over their shoulder at the First Amendment. But Sullivan, for the first time, imposed First Amendment restrictions on the power of the states to carry out their own libel laws. What is the central meaning of the First Amendment? Well, that comes right out of the Sullivan decision, where the court is discussing the Sedition Act and, in effect, finding the Sedition Act unconstitutional a century and a half after it expired, and said that the lessons learned by the Sedition Act were that we, the people, are in charge here, and we have every right to criticize government and government officials. That's the central meaning of the First Amendment. The episode of the Sedition Act crystallized our understanding of that proposition. Why are the common law protections of the press still important? Because if somebody can't make their case under the common law elements of the tort, they're out of court. The court doesn't have to reach the First Amendment issue of whether actual malice is required or has been proved. If the article in the newspaper is not of and concerning the plaintiff, or is privileged, as in the Dorsey case, those are common law elements, and the case is gone. So it's really important to the press that those common law elements are still vital and important. Are false statements of fact ever protected by the First Amendment? Yes, Sullivan certainly said so. Falsity, mistakes are inevitable in robust public debate about the issues of the day, and people can't be punished just because they got something wrong, i.e. just because their statement was false in some respect. That does not remove First Amendment protection. So Sullivan's the best source on that, and then you look at the Liar case, the Alvarez case, which is a little different in that what you're dealing with is not a mistake, not simply a false statement, but a deliberate lie, a knowing lie. No question here about knowledge of falsity or reckless disregard. This was a deliberate lie. Does that mean that it's unprotected by the First Amendment? We'll see when the Alvarez case is decided. Of course, in Alvarez, unlike the precedents cited by the government in which false statements have been punished or restricted, in Alvarez there is no identifiable victim who has been harmed by Alvarez's lie. Does that make a difference? We don't know. One of you raised on B-Space the flap last week about Rush Limbaugh and the Georgetown law student Sandra, looks like Fluke. Is that the way it's pronounced? Fluke. You're all familiar with that, right? I think it's useful to use that as a hypothetical to hammer home some of these ideas about libel, some of these concepts about libel. And first, let's assume that Fluke sues Limbaugh for defamation. One initial question might be, is this libel or is this slander? And that depends on which state she sues him in. In California, radio and television is slander. Newspapers are libel. Some other states go another way. For our purposes, it really doesn't matter whether it's slander or libel. It's clearly a defamation situation where he's calling her a slut and a prostitute. So what has to be proved in order for Fluke to win her case? Published. Was the material published? No question about that. That's what Limbaugh did when he went on the radio and made his little speech about Fluke and her use of contraception. Second, falsity. Is what he said false? Well, if you zero in on calling her a prostitute or a slut, doesn't look like there's any truth to that. It's an outrageous lie. So falsity she should be able to prove. She'd testify, I am not a prostitute. I've never taken money or anything valuable as recompense for having sex. I'm not a prostitute. And that establishes her case. Maybe she calls some character witnesses to testify that she's not a prostitute. So that's okay. Then defamatory meaning, of course. I mean, the Florida statute that Gloria Allred is attempting to get Limbaugh prosecuted under is a common law notion. Accusing a woman of a want of chastity is a classic example of defamation. So that element would be met. Fourth, is it of and concerning Fluke? Sure, talking about her by name, no question about who he's talking about. Is it unprivileged? There it gets a little tougher. The privilege that we looked at in the Dorsey case, the fair report privilege, report of what happens in a government proceeding, probably doesn't apply. You'd have to look carefully at exactly what Limbaugh was saying. I don't think he even pretended to be reporting what Fluke said or would say in her congressional testimony. There she was, poised to testify before Congress. He wasn't reporting what she had either said or was about to say, so the fair report privilege wouldn't apply. But the fair comment privilege, which we really didn't consider in any detail at all, might well apply. The fair comment privilege protects statements of opinion honestly held about a matter of public concern. And there's a bunch of old cases, you don't need to write anything down about this, just so that you know. There's a bunch of old cases that say that if the speaker, the commentator, the opinion delivering person discloses the facts on which he or she has an opinion, that can't be a libel case, because people are free to disagree with the opinion as long as everybody knows what the facts are. It's a false statement of fact that you have to prove in order to win a libel case. And if it's pure opinion based on disclosed fact, no libel case. Well, I think he would have a possibly plausible argument that his characterization of her as slut or as prostitute, based on the facts that she acknowledges, which is that she takes birth control stuff and wants the school, I guess it is, to supply contraceptives for her. You can disagree with Limbaugh and say way off base, but that doesn't entitle you to win a libel suit. I don't know how that would play out. And then there's another notion that has come up in a case that we didn't look at, where the argument was that a statement of pure opinion is protected by the First Amendment. And the court in the case called Milkovich decided that no, there's no special rule for opinion. And if a statement is couched as opinion, let's say, I think Jones killed Smith, that can be the subject of a libel suit, just as a pure statement of fact, Jones killed Smith, could be the subject of a libel suit. As long as the statement is provably true or false, it can be the subject of a libel suit. And then the court discussed rhetorical hyperbole, off-the-wall statements, sort of akin to the Hustler caricature of Falwell, where no reasonable person would believe this flight of rhetorical hyperbole. That's protected. I mean, the more outrageous it is, the more protected it is by the First Amendment. Paradoxical. And Limbaugh may have that kind of a defense to a libel suit. Assuming that she could make the common law elements, that is, no privilege applies, all the other elements are satisfied, how does Sullivan apply to her case? Well, the question is she a public official? No. Is she a public figure? She is definitely not a pervasive or all-purpose public figure, a household name type. But what about a vortex public figure, a special purpose public figure? And that requires that the person whose reputation is being trashed has voluntarily injected herself into the public arena on a particular issue. And I don't remember reading about what Fluke had done. I take it she was something of an activist, is something of an activist at Georgetown. I don't know how she came to public notice in the first place, but Nancy Pelosi then gets her to come before Congress, which she voluntarily does, and testify about the contraception issue. Well, that sounds an awful lot like a special purpose public figure. And if that's right, then she has to meet the Sullivan actual malice requirement, the constitutional fault requirement, of proving that what Limbaugh said about her was knowingly false or made with reckless disregard for truth or falsity, which may indeed be possible. If she's not a public figure, she's just a private figure, then what constitutional fault is she required to prove? Something less than actual malice, but something. And the court said in the Gertz case that even a private figure must show some fault, leaving it up to the states to decide whether it's simply negligence or it's actual malice or something else. And the states have divided between requiring actual malice and negligence. California, it's negligence, and she would have to show that Limbaugh did not act as a reasonable talk radio host does, that he was negligent in falsely claiming that she was a prostitute. And then last, on the injurious speech cases, can a public figure sue the press for intentionally inflicting emotional distress? Yes, of course. Successfully win the case, the public figure who's claiming damage from a publication, from speech, has to meet not only the elements of the intentional infliction of emotional distress tort, but the requirements imposed by Sullivan. That's the Falwell case, where Jerry Falwell sued for intentional infliction of emotional distress, and the court said he's got to prove a false statement of fact, which he couldn't do, made with actual malice. Does parody have special First Amendment protection? Well, there's no special rule on parody. It's not a category of speech that has any enhanced First Amendment protection at all. But if it's not believable, as it wasn't in the Falwell case, if nobody would think that this is factual, this parody, this satire, then it would be protected by the First Amendment, same way rhetorical hyperbole is. To what extent does the First Amendment protect advocacy of hateful ideas? Well, that, the light goes on, the alarm says, Brandenburg versus Ohio, decides that advocacy is protected speech and doesn't lose its protection unless it becomes incitement to imminent lawless activity or violation of law. So that under the First Amendment, pure advocacy, the mere abstract teaching of the worst possible ideas, is protected speech. If a person is physically injured as a result of reading published information, may he or she sue the publisher for damages? Well, I guess what that triggers is the idea that the fact that speech causes harm, including physical harm, including death, as in the Hersig versus Hustler case, does not deprive the speech of First Amendment protection. And whether somebody who's physically injured as a result of reading something may depend on their theory of the case, and there are a lot of weirdo cases where some people have recovered on negligence theories, that the publisher knew or should have known that a book called Hitman, for example, which was a manual on how to carry out murders, knew or should have known it would be used for murder, and was. Rachel, what's up? Did I say when? Yeah, advocacy is protected. Incitement to imminent lawless action is not. Bettina? You can bring it in if you want. That was the disc jockey case down in Los Angeles. Yeah, I've forgotten the other party's name. I recommend not straining to bring that in, because the court, as you saw in the Hersig case, and there have been a couple other cases that decided to deal with that idea, fumbled, and the courts didn't deal with it very honestly. The decision itself was wrong, I think, where the DJ incited high school students to go out on the freeways and the side streets in LA and chase down the missing DJ, and the consequence was that one of them ran into somebody and hurt him, killed him maybe, and they sued the radio station and won. Anyway, let's look at the sample questions from old midterms that I posted on bSpace. Short answer questions. What is, quote, actual malice? Well, we've been over that. It's defined in the glossary to begin with. It's the concept invented by Sullivan and defined in Sullivan as publishing with knowledge of falsity or reckless disregard for the truth. What did the court in Sullivan say is the central meaning of the First Amendment? That was one of the big questions. What, in addition to the common law elements of defamation, does the First Amendment require a public figure to win to prove a libel case? Falsity. Now, the plaintiff has to prove falsity instead of falsity being a defense. Instead of truth being a defense, and actual malice or constitutional fault. Under our First Amendment, can the author of a book be punished for advocating ethnic cleansing or genocide? That's the advocacy incitement issue. And I would, if I were answering that question, I would seriously question whether anything in a book could ever be considered incitement. That's highly unlikely to be able imminently to cause law violation, violence, and so on. And then we had this multiple choice question, which is sort of like the false statement questions that you'll have on Thursday. This one was about Falwell suing Hustler magazine, and answer A was he lost his claim for intentional infliction of emotional distress in the Supreme Court. That's the correct answer. When Falwell sued Hustler, he lost his claim in the Supreme Court, and then your job would be to explain why that is so. And we just talked about that a minute ago. Then some false statements. He won his libel claim because deliberate malicious character assassination is not protected by the First Amendment. Well, that's not true, and you can explain why that's not true. That having a bad motive, hating the plaintiff, wishing him the worst, ill will, hatred, intent to hurt, maliciousness, does not deprive the speech of First Amendment protection. Deliberate malicious character assassination is what Falwell's lawyer argued in the Supreme Court, and said that that's not protected speech. The court, without using those words, decided that what Hustler had